I was never good in farewells. Maybe that's why you avoided visiting Mom in the last months of her life. Cancer was a relentless sentence, and I convinced myself that I was too busy with work, with my own life, to face that. But now, stopping in the funeral hall, surrounded by the heavy smell of flowers and muffled murmurs of the other morning, I realized that there is nothing more cruel than the definitive absence. The coffin was closed, a decision of the funeral home, they said, due to her condition. I knew they had chosen a light blue dress, his favorite, to the funeral. It was the same as she used on my wedding day. Years ago, first of all goes wrong. I had spent hours looking at that carefully folded dress over her bed, trying to prepare to see her last time. Now he just looked like a cold symbol of the distance between us. I adjusted the flowers around the coffin, my shaking hands holding a bouquet of white lilies. The petals were soft against my fingers, but the emotional weight of the flowers seemed overwhelming. As I packed the branches, I noticed the mirror on the opposite wall. He reflected the entire hall, the empty chairs, the polished coffin, and I, small and lost in the center of everything. It was then that I saw her. In the reflection, behind me, there was a figure, a woman. She was still, watching me with an expression I couldn't decipher. My heart jumped inside my chest. I froze, unable to breathe or think clearly. Slowly, I turned, hoping to find someone standing there. But there was no one. It must be tiredness, I muttered to myself, rubbing my eyes. The throbbing headache that had carried from the morning seemed to be able to throb even stronger now. I adjusted the flowers again, trying to ward off the image from the mind. But when I looked again in the mirror, she was still there. This time, the figure was closer. I could clearly see his face. It was impossible. It was Mom, wearing the same light blue dress as the coffin. Her hair was tidy exactly like that old photo I kept on the bedside table. She smiled at me through the glass, her lips moving without emitting any sound. My whole body became cold. "This is not happening," I whispered, spinning again. Behind me, nothing but the silence and the elongated shadows of the candles lit. Nobody. I stared at the mirror again, and this time she tilted her head slightly, as if studying me. I felt a knot squeeze my throat. I wanted to scream, run, get out, but my feet seemed attached to the floor. Everything around me seemed distant, as if the real world had been replaced by something denser, heavier. She slowly lifted her hand, pointing to the coffin. I didn't understand what she meant, or maybe I didn't want to understand. My heart hammered so loudly that I could barely hear my own thoughts. I looked into the coffin, after back in the mirror. She was still there, her fixed look at me, insistent. A wave of adrenaline took over me. I walked away quickly, stumbled on my own legs as I walked away from the mirror. Some people in the hall looked at me, confused, but I couldn't form words. My mouth was dry, my blurred vision. I needed to get out of there. I ran out of the building, the fresh night air hitting my face. I stopped under a pole of light, trying to recover my breath. It was then that I realized the light blue dress she wore in the reflection was identical to what I had seen folded in her bed, and somehow it made everything even scarier. I returned to the hall minutes later, hesitant. This time the environment seemed different, less welcoming, darker. The mirror was still there, but the figure did not appear again. At least, not as I stared at. Later, during the funeral, I couldn't get that image out of the head. Each word pronounced by Father sounded away, as if it were part of another world. When the coffin was lowered to earth, I felt a presence behind me, though no one was there. I turned several times, certain that I would see something, or someone, but I always found only the emptiness. That night, alone at home, I dreamed of the mirror. I dreamed of Mom, his calm and enigmatic smile, his hand pointing to the coffin. Thing was not over yet. We were spent weeks until I finally gathered courage to return to the funeral hall. I don't know what I expected to find. Maybe answers. Perhaps just a way to put an end to it all. The place was empty, except for an employee who received me with a polite smile. "Can I help you?" she asked. I shook my head hesitant. "I came here a few weeks ago to my mother's wake. I just wanted to see the hall again." She frowned, confused. "There was no funeral here recently," he said gently. "This space has been closed for renovations since last month." I felt the floor disappear under my feet. I stared at her incredulously. "He is sure? I was here. I saw so many things." She shook her head, patient. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I think there must have been some mistake." I went out stunned, not knowing what to think. For days, I questioned my sanity. Did I imagine everything? Or did Mom really find a way to say goodbye? To this day, I'm not sure. But sometimes, when I look into the mirror at home, I have the strange feeling that I'm not completely alone. I was never superstitious. I always thought the world was a rational place, where things happened for logical and predictable reasons. But after my grandmother's funeral, something changed inside me. Or maybe it was just her house, with her dark corners and persistent smell of lavender, which seemed to whisper secrets that I didn't want to hear. She had been a peculiar woman, created at a time when watches were more than mere devices to mark time. She treated her old pendulum watch like a family member. It was a huge and clumsy piece, all made of dark wood, with golden Roman numbers that shone under the faint light of the candles she insisted on lighting every night. I always found it exaggerated, but now, sitting alone in that silent room, I began to understand why that object meant so much for her. The funeral was fast and simple, as she would have wanted. It was at 3:33 a.m., an unusual time chosen by the local priest because it was more convenient for the other appointments of the day. I did not question. I was too tired to argue. When I returned to her house, still dressed in black and with swollen eyes from crying, I realized something strange. The clock still. He always marked the time with almost obsessive accuracy, but now his hands were frozen, pointing exactly to 3:33 a.m. I thought it was coincidence. Perhaps the rusty gears had finally succumbed to the weight of the years. I decided to leave it like this, as a kind of makeshift memorial. There was no reason to fix it after all, or at least that's what I thought until that first night. I was almost sleeping when I heard the sound. A tall, deep echoed through the house, so clear that it made me jump out of bed. I looked at the cell phone. 3H33. My heart began to beat faster as I tried to sue what had just happened. The clock didn't work. I had inspected him myself before going to bed, making sure the pendulum was still. So, what was that? At first, I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, some external noise amplified by the silence of dawn. But the next night, it happened again. And in the other too. Every night, without fail, at 3:33 a.m., the clock played. They were not random or fragile snaps of old wood. They were clear, rhythmic, as if someone invisible were spinning the key and roaming the machine. I started to avoid sleeping. He spent the night sitting on the room armchair, staring at the clock, waiting for him to betray some secret. But he remained impassive, his dark surface vaguely reflecting the moonlight that entered the window. During the day, I was trying to distract myself by cleaning the house, organizing old photographs boxes and dusty books. But none of this erased the feeling that something or someone was watching me. On the fifth night, I decided to confront the problem. I grabbed a chair and climbed it, determined to open the rear compartment of the clock. My hands trembled as I trimmed the wooden lid. Inside, I found a complex and rusty mechanism, covered by a thin layer of dust. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary except for a small, cautiously folded envelope, and stuck with tape to the inner side of the compartment. My heart fired as I unfolded the yellowish paper. The handwriting was unmistakable. My grandmother was. She had written a few lines, but they were enough to make me feel a shiver on my pimple. Asterisk. Dear, if you are reading this, it's because it's time to know the truth. This watch keeps more than hours. It marks important moments of our family. If it works again after I leave, it means that there is still something I need to tell you. Listen carefully, because time doesn't wait for anyone. I swallowed hard, my fingers pressing the ticket until it needed it. That made no sense. How could she have predicted this? And what exactly did she want to tell me? That night, the clock played again. But this time, something different happened. After the 3 habitual chips, there was a long, tense break. Then a voice, weak, distorted, but unmistakably familiar, left the inside of the clock. My girl. I felt my whole body freeze. It was her. My grandmother. His words were fragmented, as if they came from far away. But each syllable carried a weight that made me fall to my knees on the floor. Take care. Trust yourself. Remember who you are. And then, silence. I stayed there for hours, unable to move, until the sun was born shyly through the curtains. When finally gathered courage to approach the clock, I realized that he had stopped again. This time, however, his hands pointed to 12:00. We have passed weeks since that night. The clock never touched, and I decided to keep it in a closet, far from sight. Sometimes I think of throwing it away, but something prevents me. Maybe it's the fear of losing the last connection I have with her. Or maybe it's curiosity, that uncomfortable feeling that there are still unanswered questions. Today, I keep living in that house, surrounded by the objects and memories she left behind. I learned to accept that some things simply cannot be explained. Time, after all, is much more mysterious than any clock can measure.